Hi, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar here this morning, State Support for Intercity Buses. Um, we've got a couple of folks here today who will be talking about the intercity bus industry. The webinar today is hosted by State Smart Transportation Initiative, and I'll give a little intro about our organization. I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll go ahead and jump right in. So just to give everyone a little bit of introduction to the subject, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, changes in the business environment, intercity bus travel saw a bit of a decline in service in recent years, but ridership is trending back up, as you may hear about, and states have a great opportunity to support intercity bus travel that can improve mobility and access for folks in rural and urban areas across your respective state. So if you'd like to ask questions of our panelists along the way, you can use the Q&A function, which is different from the chat. My colleague, Megan, will be moderating the questions for the two speakers, and we'll have a Q&A portion at the end where we'll be able to address some of those questions. Um, if you're not familiar with our organization, SSTI, we are State Smart Transportation Initiative. It's a project that's based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It supports state transportation agencies that are committed to equity, sustainability, and transparency. My name's Eric Murphy. We also have my colleague Megan Link, and our director Chris McCahill is here as well. Um, and a little bit more about us, what we do. We build the capacity of agency staff at those state transportation agencies through research and technical assistance. We also convene top officials from those agencies from around the country. We're about to do that next week with our community of practice meetings. And we share knowledge and lift up best practices in the field. That's what we're about to do here right now. And so I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, both of them first. Joseph Schwieterman will be up first. He's a professor at DePaul University. He's also the director of that university's Chaddock Institute for Metropolitan Development. He's a past president of the Transportation Research Forum and authors the annual Outlook for Intercity Bus Industry report, and edits a newsletter that's called Intercity Bus E-News. So for folks who are looking for regular updates on this topic, that's a great resource. And our second panelist is Ben Gelman. He's the Bustang Program Manager at Colorado Department of Transportation. He leads strategic and operational planning for Bustang, which is CDOT's statewide bus system. And Ben is committed to making it safer, easier, and more affordable for Coloradans of all ages and abilities to travel without having to rely on a personal vehicle. So those are our panelists. And without further ado, I'll throw it over to Joe to get us started.
Thank you, Eric. Delighted to be here. I jumped at the opportunity to speak to an audience that is really in the know about bus transportation and just having a few difficulties with my screen share here. Give me 1 second. I should have that up in a moment. There we go. Great. So again, I'm Joe Sweeterman. I'm a DePaul University professor. We're in downtown Chicago and spent a lot of time in intercity bus, maybe more than usual this summer because of the station problems we're facing around the country. But I try to fill a gap, I think, in a sector that is so important. It's had a pretty nice post-pandemic rebound, as Eric said. Lots of challenges, but what's really exciting, as I'll say today, is how state governments are really getting in on the act, so to speak. We've long had state-supported rail service, but the interstate bus side is under development, I think, in a really exciting way. And I wish I could say the same about municipal city governments, which I think are only kind of now getting to know the intercity bus industry. So I'm going to walk through some highlights. I'm going to be pretty brief here, just 15 or 17 minutes or so. So as Eric mentioned, I do an annual Outlook for Intercity Bus report. It's designed for practitioners. It's about 20 pages. It's divided by region, and we try to summarize, we think, the big stories in each region and look at some of the competitive situations that bus lines face. And it's really been interesting because when I started this, it was sort of all about Greyhound and Megabus, the two big national carriers. Megabus is mostly no longer with us. With of course Flix Mobility buying Greyhound, and that's added a new twist. And now state governments are really featured pretty prominently in this. I also make an effort to ride the system, so maybe 3 or 4 times a year I'll have a chance to ride some of the services. So I've been on the North Carolina system, Mustang, Virginia Breeze, and some others, which we're going to talk about, just to kind of experience what the services are like. So some big stories from last year. Um, One was that Flix Mobility, which of course is parent company of Greyhound, Flix USA, launched a new website and gave Greyhound reserved seats. And it's was rolled out around last February. And there's also other options like you can travel neighbor free for a little extra money, enhanced bus tracker program. So there was some nice progress there, and we see Flix and Greyhound are increasingly, I call it interlining with each other. They're the same company, in effect, same owner, but you can now transfer between Flix and Greyhound buses on through tickets, which has opened up a whole new set of connections that previously didn't exist when Flix was kind of a standalone operation. So, for example, you could ride Flix from Chicago to Detroit, I know, from Detroit to Chicago, and then jump on a Greyhound from Chicago to St. Louis on a through ticket. And we call that the larger system, the Greyhound with the interline bus network, which is really important. So 2 years ago, uh, all people wanted to seem to talk about was a shortage of drivers and mechanics, and that's eased up. I get my hand slapped sometime when I say that because people say it's eased up because we're spending 5 times as much to find drivers as we used to with training programs and community college outreach and all kind of strategies to find drivers. But we're not hearing as many stories about service cancellations or trips frequencies cut until the driver situation improves. Cross your fingers. Our wages are up as well, and that's put pressure on the big lines. But one thing we have noticed is that bus lines, the commercial bus lines, haven't added back service in response in direct proportion to how demand has responded. So we think nationwide, we're probably, and this is a very general number, about 85% of pre-pandemic, maybe a little bit higher than that, which puts it well above public transit in major cities in terms of recovery. But bus lines haven't added back service quite as intensely, so the load factors are higher. We're seeing more buses go out full. Fares are a bit higher, not much higher, but slightly higher. So the fundamentals of the industry's profitability aren't too bad right now. Just there's fewer coaches on the road than before pre-pandemic. So this year, and I'm going to be real short about this, is we've lost quite a few Greyhound stations when Flix purchased Greyhound. The previous owner, they didn't buy the stations. The previous owner sold the stations to a real estate holding company, but stations we're now redeveloping some of the properties, but stations are closing for lots of different reasons. In Cincinnati, the site was key for a casino expansion. Um, in Los Angeles, a deal was brokered to move to a Los Angeles Union Station for Greyhound and Flix. So every city has a different story, but it's led to quite a bit of pain out there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we're on the cusp of Chicago now. Any day we'll probably hear an announcement of what's going to happen. But we've been fighting pretty hard for the city government to really take seriously the need for a good station in Chicago. And it's 50-50 right now whether the station lease will be extended or whether we'll find a end up moving to a curbside spot. So what we're seeing more and more of around the country, and this has mostly worked well, but there's a lot of complexities as interstate bus lines move into transit centers. So here's the Las Vegas South Strip Transit Terminal, which is one of the success stories where the Greyhound station closed. And they now leave from a really nice transit terminal. I wish I could say all transit terminals were this nice, but I picked one that I thought exemplified what could happen if city governments beefed up their waiting rooms and provided a comprehensive bus service facility. And there's a lot of tension here because federal law requires transit agencies to give reasonable access to their transit hubs, but it doesn't specify the price or the terms, the conditions. So a lot of them are putting pretty heavy demands on using transit centers, such as you need, say, two full-time security guards there at all time, which is very costly. So that's a big concern. So Atlanta's a success story. New terminal opened last year with city and state involvement, using some. We heard some sort of bailed up federal funds that were not spent during the pandemic, but you can see the MARTA viaduct in the background for the train, the metro. So it's a real prototype of what we think needs to happen. So just in my last 5 minutes or so here, I want to just walk through some state success stories and also describe how we're trying to map the intercity bus network. And reporters often get upset when I tell them we don't know how many people ride intercity buses. We don't know how many daily trips there are, how many cities are served, because there is no comprehensive data set. And you're not required to report most types of services to the federal government. And I say Holiday Inn doesn't report how many people stay overnight. And bus companies, private bus companies don't have that obligation either. Maybe they should, but they don't. So one big development is I'm working with the Intercity Bus Atlas team at the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, but Transcar Data Services has created an online link in which you can map the GTFS routes of most major bus companies, the ones that they work with, and a few others. So here's an example. If you map Fullington, Indian Trails, and Jefferson, you get a map. And this is a really good way to study the scope of the system if you add the other big lines. It doesn't have, of course, a lot of the smaller ethnic carriers and the like, but it's a really good tool. I can share the link if you'd like. So examples of state-supported networks. I'm just going to go through some. One that I think is often held out as really a best practice is Virginia Breeze. It's got a really nice branding to it. Radiates from Washington Union Station in the nation's capital. And one by one, routes are being added, and with pretty wide state coverage. And next year, they have announced they're going to add their first east-west route, which will run from Virginia Beach to Harrisonburg, which you can see on the slide there. And it's going to be sort of a lateral route that won't involve downtown DC. But this system, was sold on the Coach USA website, the Megabus website, which is real handy for people to use. It's not interlined with Greyhound, so there's no interline there. But I think really tight branding and contract have allowed this to have many ridership records set recently. So the pandemic, of course, slowed things down, but ridership is back. And here's a picture I got of the West Falls Church stop, Virginia Breeze, with their sort of nice branding. Next one I mentioned is North Carolina, which is a really complex and fascinating network. There's actually quite a few different providers here. Greyhound is used, Sunway Charters, and it complements the state's pretty extensive Piedmont train service, although the bus stations in both Charlotte and Raleigh, I believe, are still at different locations than the train. But they also give their routes individual names, which is nice, like the Mountaineer North South runs from Charlotte, which is in the middle of your screen there, uh, to Boone, which is in the west, and the Mid-State Express runs from Winston-Salem over to Fayetteville. And so this too is they're real good about sharing ridership milestones when they achieve it, and have a university that supports some of the analysis of how the routes are doing. You can see a nice map that shows subsidized and unsubsidized routes, which some other states do too, but they view the system very holistically as being complementary to the interline bus network, which includes Greyhound and Southeast Stages and other lines. So North Carolina is really having some good momentum. Here's a picture on the Raleigh terminal, which I think was one of those still privately owned by Greyhound. So we'll see what happens to that in the next few years, and if consolidation of rail and bus in the same location becomes possible. Washington State is, I think, um, always on the cutting edge of marketing. And you can see by this really nice route map. And what's neat too is these routes are given names that sort of reflect the geographic nature of it. But it also stands out. Mini buses are used on many routes here, smaller than full size buses. Um, but it's interlined both with Amtrak and Greyhound. So a person going from Port Angeles in the Northwest there can buy a ticket, either airlines with Amtrak or with Greyhound. So there's really good connectivity. And I think last year we heard a report that there were, approaching pre-pandemic levels. Some really fun marketing. Here's the Apple route, which give the artist extra credit for that one because it just creates, these branding. I think creates a sense when people buy a ticket. Okay, am I going to be getting on an old intercity bus? Is it going to be unpleasant? Am I going to feel like you know, waiting with people that I'd rather not be with? There's all those sort of stigmas that people have with the intercity bus service. So when states brand it and sort of put their name behind it, in this case, Washington State DOT, I think it opens up markets to people that might not otherwise consider the bus. So a couple others I'll mention in my last few minutes here is Wisconsin um, has a nice network as well, and this network you can see they've mapped the routes, and there's subsidized routes are shown with the dash system. And Wisconsin's often system serves areas that are really pretty hard to reach if you don't have a car, like this northern route from Green Bay, which runs across the northern part of the state through Clare all the way to South Bend. Um, is kind of a lifeline in the sense it serves areas that are far from commercial airports and fills a gap. Also, there's a nice network. We really think the intermodal terminal at Milwaukee um, is a good design because it brings rail and bus together in one place. Amtrak uses Wisconsin services to operate Chicago to Green Bay via Milwaukee. And so the Wisconsin system sort of, I think, having steady gains, which has been good to see. Here's a picture I got of a Lammers bus, I believe, going to Platteville at the Wisconsin terminal last year. So in Ohio is the last one I'll mention here. And if I didn't mention your state, it's partly because I just picked five, and there's quite a few others I could have mentioned. And if these are your states, you're welcome to unmute yourself and add some detail later because it's love to learn about this. So the Ohio system is interesting because it's run by mostly by Barron's Bus, and it's fully integrated into the Greyhound network. So Barron's runs routes itself that link to Greyhound and Go Bus routes with the Barron's Bus branding. And this state, Barron's give them a lot of credit for having station issues in all three of their biggest cities, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. Columbus, a very complicated situation with the neighbors. Bus lines moved out of the downtown terminal into a suburban commercial facility. The neighbors were upset. They found an arrangement, I think, which is quite workable, where the commercial facility they're using is only used for transfers, and where people boarding and alighting in Columbus will get on downtown or at the airport. So it's kind of a compromise solution that I haven't heard before, but it's allowed that hub to continue. And now plans are being made to move out of the famous historic Cleveland Greyhound station as well. So all three of the big cities, Barron's has had to go into overdrive to uh, provide quality stations. So and there's a photo of a driver at Fort Wayne, Indiana, on the Columbus route, which runs through to Chicago to connect there. So last one is Oregon, which is really cool because they have a website that's got an interactive map where you can click the stations and it pulls up information about uh, the stop. This too is integrated with Amtrak, but I pointed out because the Cascade Corridor is something we're encouraging other states like Illinois to do, and that's to develop rail but have buses fill the gap in between times where there's no trains and sell that all on Amtrak.com. So if you go to Portland to Eugene, you got a number of trains. I forget how many a day, but quite a few. And then buses fill a couple gaps and gives people complimentary bus service. So lots going on in the rural world, which I don't have time to discuss here, but lots of states doing things on more rural routes that are long distance, sometimes with vans, sometimes with buses, just a few days a week. Here's just a sampling, and I try to keep track of these, but there's no centralized location to get the news. So please send me information if your state is doing things to report. So thank you for that. If you'd like to join our listserv, we do not spam people. We send maybe one email out every 3 weeks or so. Just email chaddock.edu and we'll put you on the Intercity Bus listserv for our newsletters and annual report. Eric, that's a bit it for me. Thank you much.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. And it looks like we're getting some good questions in the Q&A and the chat here. We'll still hold on to those till the end. But I will throw it over to Ben Gelman. For those of you who are joining late, he's with Colorado Department of Transportation and Bustang. So Ben, go ahead when you're ready.
Awesome. Let's see. Great. Well, yeah, Eric, thanks for having me. And great presentation, Joe. Always good to hear from you, your observations on the state of the transit nationwide. So yeah, my name is Ben Gelman. I am our Bustang program manager at the Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT, our Office of Innovative Mobility, or OIM. Lots of acronyms. We always love acronyms in government. So I'll start off with just a history of the Bustang service. Prior to 2015, there really were kind of limited intercity options for travel within Colorado. We did have, of course, those private carriers such as Greyhound, Burlington Trailways, and so on. But oftentimes we found that those intercity bus timetables weren't exactly optimized for travel within Colorado. For instance, we'd have buses coming through the wee hours of the morning, or generally just not possible to be useful service for folks both from or visiting Colorado. On top of that, there was a single publicly operated route between Denver and Colorado Springs, the second largest metro area in the state, that ran from the 2000s to 2012. And that was operated by a local agency that just ran out of the funding sources for that. So after 2012, there really was no publicly operated intercity bus service to speak of in the state. So with that in mind, in 2015, Bustang launched as a primarily I-25 commuter-focused service. There was no weekend service at launch. We did have a single weekday trip operating between Denver and Glenwood Springs, which goes through the I-70 mountain corridor, hitting a lot of our ski towns, resort areas, that kind of thing. And that service, when it launched, was fully state funded via vehicle registration fees. For those who are interested in the details, we call our faster funding. So here's just our launch map. As you can see, it is decent connectivity along our interstate highway system. I-25, often referred to as the Front Range as well. So just for an example of scale, for those from smaller states, from Denver to Fort Collins and Denver to Colorado Springs, it's between 60 and 70 miles driving distance from city center to city center. And from Denver to Glenwood Springs, it's about 150 miles. So nothing to sneeze at. But yeah, we launched with those 5 weekday round trips on north and south, and that 1 weekday round trip on the west line. As we continued to build out the system, we did launch our rural-focused busing outrider network in 2018. With that, that's where we noticed that the needs of rural Coloradans were not really being met with our existing state-supported private carriers. So for this, we kind of pulled back our 5311F federal funding, mixed that with some other both state and federal sources to roll out a really rural-focused network and really expand that backbone of transit in Colorado. On top of that, we also added our Pegasus shuttle service in 2022. That was mostly imagined as a kind of a TDM solution, really, to a massive construction project on our I-70 mountain corridor, our Floyd Hill project that our partners in the engineering side of CDOT are working on currently. And beyond that, we do have seasonal services that we operate throughout the year. Our most popular of that is snow staying, which connects Denver metro residents and visitors to a number of winter resort communities in Colorado and provides great service on that as well. We've also got a Mustang to Estes service that connects folks from Denver and Boulder areas to Rocky Mountain National Park, including going to and through the gate, so that we drop folks off right at the Rocky Mountain National Park park and ride, where they can then use the park's own circulator buses to really get to trailheads, explore nature, all without having to use that single occupancy vehicle, or for folks who either can't or don't want to drive. So here's kind of what our map looks like now. As you can see, we do still have that same 4 kind of sideways T layout for the I-25 north and south routes, as well as our west route. Our west route now, which expands to Grand Junction, which is stone's throw from the Utah border. So really expansive service. And as you can see, most of the other lines that are on here are our outrider services. And what we really want to focus on is that it's not just pretty lines on a map. It's really connecting Coloradans of all backgrounds with the essential services and other intercity travel needs that they may have, whether it's visiting family or just wanting to go visit a mountain town for the day or for the weekend. So we've as with other agencies throughout the country and other intercity carriers throughout the country, our ridership was absolutely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So just for background here, this chart is showing our ridership for fiscal years. In Colorado, our fiscal year runs from July to June of the following year. So for example, we just wrapped fiscal 2024 this past June. But as you can see, our total ridership on our what we call our main lines, that's the I-25 and I-70 services, the ridership on those lines combined now equals about what it was in fiscal year 2019, which was our last full year before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can also see that our I-25 services are still, lagging behind what they were before the pandemic. We're still at about 60% of that total ridership from fiscal 2019, uh, equating to about 108,000 riders for the North and South lines combined, which is about 60% of what our pre-pandemic peak was. That said, though, our ridership on the I-70 West corridor is up 90% for fiscal 24 compared to fiscal 19. For fiscal 24, when you combine that West Line service and that Pegasus shuttle service that I mentioned, we carried about 125,000 passengers on those two routes combined. So we've been really proud of that. It's grown more than I think anyone would have imagined at service launch. And yeah, as you can see here, even in fiscal 22, from July 2021 through June 2022, when most of those restrictions were getting lifted, that West Line was still exceeding its pre-pandemic baseline. So it's already bounced back and really grown, and kind of been shouting out for more service as demonstrated by passengers. That said, there have been challenges along the way, especially when it comes to scaling up the service and from transitioning from kind of the startup model that we launched with in the middle of 2015 to where we're at now, where we will be within the next year. A lot of that, is just kind of coming into our own as a statewide transit agency. Our legislature did define our Division of Transit and Rail as a proper transit agency back in, I want to say, 2009 or so. And we've really been kind of growing our legs beneath us since then. So part of that has been, scaling up our budget. We launched with about a $3 million annual budget. And over the next couple of years, we'll get to about 10 times that initial annual operating budget. We've also had to learn along the way how to manage our fleet. So state of Colorado, while we do contract out the actual operation of the routes, we still own all of our rolling stock. So all of the buses that you see are directly owned by CDOT and leased out to our various private operators. So along with that, it's been a challenge working hand in hand with our private operator to make sure that we have enough drivers to actually operate the service, as I'm sure a lot of folks who work in transit can relate to. So, other items along with this was just, as I mentioned, becoming a more proper transit agency, including developing a solid asset management plan with a fleet replacement cycle and schedule and financial forecast for that, as well as developing service standards for when to add, remove, or modify existing or new service. We're working on that at the division level now through probably through about the middle of next year. So I mentioned that our budget is increasing dramatically, but that a lot of that was really fueled by additional state funding. So Colorado SB 22-180, which was signed in May 2022, provided $30 million over 3 years to implement a pilot service expansion program. And that funding will run us through the end of this current fiscal year into June of 2025. So as you can see here, I won't get into all the details on this table, but from before 2022 to where we will be by the end of this year, we are doubling our service on the I-25 corridor, both north and south. And we are more than tripling our I-70 service, which it's pretty impressive, and it's pretty scary from the implementation side, making sure that we get that out the door and delivered in a great manner. So pivoting a little bit, also want to focus on how we at CDOT are supporting and increasing the impact of our service expansion. So for instance, I'm going to call out the North I-25 Mobility Hubs program. So as you can see on the map here, the purple circles are existing stops on our North Line. Uh, Denver in the south on that right-hand image, and Fort Collins on the north on that left-hand image. And the pins there represent mobility hubs that are either open, under construction, or undergoing final planning. So what these hubs will allow us to do is to better connect with our local transit agencies along the route and to increase the speed and reliability of our service, especially on that I-25 corridor. So for instance, the Centera Loveland Mobility Hub, it's about 2/3, 3/4 of the way from Denver to Fort Collins. That's a major suburban area. And with this rendering here, you can see that we are rolling out these center loading bus platforms along with sawtooths for local transit, more off the highway, and good parking availability for those that wish to park and ride. But it's not just the park and ride. We are really hoping to leverage our relationships and connections with our local transit agencies to kind of serve as, for busting, the first and last 5 miles, if you will. A lot of times local agencies talk about the first and last mile problem. For busting, if we want to really reduce those local vehicle miles traveled as well, then we rely on local transit and other active transit modes to work that out. So here's just some images of that Centera Loveland Mobility Hub on the left here. Here's a detail from still during construction, but you can see how we've got those areas with sound walls separating the boarding platforms from the rest of the highway. For those who've ever been on like a light rail platform or a bus platform along a highway, then it's loud. So it's just those little kind of quality of life things, that covered walkway, that nice bus shelter that you can see from the highway as you drive by, that we're really hoping to attract new people to the service and to bring back folks who have kind of become more hesitant to travel those distances for work. Another example of this is our Berthoud Mobility Hub. This station is currently open. As you can see on the image or the rendering on the left, towards the top of the screen there, we've got our center loading bus platform as well. This is a slightly different model. So instead of having both 2 dedicated walkways up to the platform for cost savings here, we did go with a single walkway up, but still covered, and still that center loading platform that will keep buses from having to deviate onto those local surface streets to serve our customers. What we're really proud of here is with our new mobility hubs, we will be able to add stops along that north line while either keeping our end-to-end runtime the same or even reducing it potentially. So the Centera Loveland Mobility Hub is replacing an existing stop that added 5 to 15 minutes sometimes, depending on traffic on those surface streets, to our total runtime. So we're really trying to speed up that service, make it more reliable, dependable, comfortable for our customers. And here's just another detail of that Berthoud Mobility Hub. As I mentioned, this station has opened to the public, and yeah, we're pretty proud of it. So at this point, turn it over back to Eric and Megan. And yeah, thanks y'all for joining us, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the presentation. And I see we've got some good questions coming in with the Q&A and in the chat. So we'll start with those questions here. Wanted to kick it off, maybe, some states may not do as much in terms of transit operations. They may be kind of getting their feet wet with some of this work. So just wanted to ask any clear lessons or just advice for first steps that people may want to know. And
So
either Ben or Joe, feel free
yeah, oh yeah,
to
yeah.
take that one.
I'm just going to take a whack at the question about branding and related to states that are trying to move up the sophistication curve. Regarding the branding question, in my view, buses are like moving billboards. And, when you travel down the interstate, you're always seeing buses. You look at them, uh, clever branding or names give it an identity. And so when people consider travel, they may have seen it or heard it. Often those buses themselves can have information, like Red Coach in Florida. They list the actual route on the bus itself. So it says, Orlando, West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Miami. So, hundreds and hundreds of people a day see that. Uh, Regarding social media, that's a little bit harder. I think the sophistication of websites has gone up dramatically. I showed you Oregon's website, which is really quite nice, where you can sort of play around with it and see when buses leave from a certain destination. But it's part of a larger problem, and many people haven't traveled on an intercity bus in many, many years. So attracting those audiences sort of require clever, innovative ways beyond just traditional advertisements. So that's just some quick thoughts on that.
Great. And we can maybe move on to some of our other Q&A questions as well.
Yeah, so I see a question here from Jonathan. About busting, did you evaluate the opportunity to, or could you even legally create a public agency or division to operate the buses directly? So yes, we do have that authority under state statute to do so. At this time, though, we really do find it most effective and most manageable to contract out most of our day-to-day operations. Just for a little peek behind the curtain, our entire bus operations unit here on the DOT side is about 4.5 people. So we really just don't have the capacity at this point, or probably into the even medium and perhaps long term to do that in-house. So we're really happy with our private operator at this point. We just concluded our RFP service or RFP process for a second contract, and we, through this competitive process, we did end up retaining our incumbent operator.
And Ben, I see a question here for Bustang about success in tracking demographics and trip purpose. And I'm also curious, kind of related to that, if you are able to kind of explain the difference in the trends between two of the routes you highlighted, the I-25 and I-70 there.
Absolutely. So I don't have the demographic information available off the top of my head. We have worked with our communications partner and our marketing partner to conduct onboard surveys. We, broad strokes, we have found that our I-25 service continues to be mostly either commuter focused or especially student, like higher education focused. Between, sorry, Denver is, of course, the biggest metro area in the state and the biggest city for hundreds of miles around. So we have a lot of folks traveling up to Fort Collins to attend Colorado State University. We've also got some great educational institutions down south in the Springs, Colorado Springs, and to Points West. So we do see folks using that. On our west line, though, we do see that it is primarily either recreation or leisure travel. Colorado, we're really proud of our ski and snowboard resorts. And especially in those winter months, we get heavy ridership both on our west line and then connecting to the local agencies up in the mountains that get folks to those actual resort areas when we're not able to ourselves.
Great.
I'll jump
And
in. Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
see. I see a question in there about tribal service and how the federal government may coordinate with that, and that's actually a very timely question because I think state governments really take the lead on that. And the state I'm following with great interest is South Dakota, which of course has a large Native American population. And there's a number of operators there that really specialize in really long distance service to reservations and so forth. But one thing South Dakota is doing is one thing, embarking on a large plan about its statewide service to integrate it better with the national bus network. But they've pioneered approach where some of these rural operators, which run just a few days a week, actually can sell through tickets on Greyhound. So you can, buy a ticket from McLaughlin, South Dakota, all the way to Denver or Chicago, and they provide a lot of support to customers who come in and say, "Look, I need to go to Chicago. There's a funeral. What should I do?" And they have, very, I think, gentle but efficient process to coach people. On Wednesday, we have a bus and we have a through ticket we can sell you. And it's our hope that eventually a lot of these rural operators will interline with other bus companies so you can sell through tickets. That's a big lift, though. It takes a lot of work. There's requirements that Greyhound and Jefferson Lines and others impose to make it work. Because if you miss a connection, it can be a bit of a disaster with somebody, stuck at a convenience store waiting for a Greyhound that's not coming for a day. Um, so the federal government is really wanting to see more of that, but much of the leadership of that is on a state level. So I'd welcome people on the call if they want to share any anecdotes about that or pose other questions because yeah, there's a lot happening there.
All right. And if anybody does want to jump in or maybe throw something in the chat, that could be another way to respond as well. I wanted to pull together two questions in the Q&A here, sort of related. I think, we have one question about kind of the subsidized and non-subsidized lines, kind of integrating service in that respect, and then also across state lines. And just was curious if either of you have perspectives about, integrating those services across those state lines for interstate bus service, or also just any experience with how that kind of hybrid subsidized and unsubsidized model works for you.
And do you want to take a whack or I jump in on that one?
Sure. Yeah, so at present, uh, we are only authorized to operate within the state of Colorado. That said, we do our very best to have stations that connect with the broader interstate travel network when possible. So, for instance, our primary stop in Denver is Denver Union Station, which is a really wonderful, built within the past 10, 15 years, facility operated by Denver's Regional Transportation District. When we operate into there, there's either a direct transfer available between private intercity bus carriers or a single seat transfer or a single transfer availability to get to Denver International Airport, where you can go just about anywhere. So yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Joe.
Yeah, you raise a good point. There's really two ways to offer that connectivity for people long distance. One, let them piece the trip together themselves. So in your case, somebody can go from Grand Junction to Denver, take another trip, on a different ticket to Chicago, and people and that's actually the way it's done almost everywhere else in the world. So you go to Europe, you don't have these multi-leg bus trips. Generally, you buy, your own trips and frequency is high enough. They've missed one bus. It's no big deal. There's another one in 3 hours. In the US, that gets tricky because sometimes the bus runs once a day or twice a day, and a misconnection can be a disaster. And you're not going to get, airline style, um, personal service, which you could argue that's not very good these days, but the airlines usually figure out a way to get you there. Uh, and you're often, if you're piecing your own trip together, you won't even get minimal service. But both the Greyhound Interline Network and Trailways, which has an independent website, both have algorithms now that allow services to connect on through tickets. And that's getting much more sophisticated in terms of the algorithms that build schedules, the services you get. If you miss your connection, there's now hotlines you can call and bots. My bus is an hour late. Am I going to miss my connection? And the person at the end of the bot will respond and let you know, rest easy. We're going to hold the bus for you. So I think we're making some good strides in people taking those out of state trips to have um, services available to them. But on a more philosophical level, I think states have to decide if that's really their mission to cater to people traveling out of the state. And I think you said it well, Ben, that Mustang is mostly set up to carry people in the state, but by design, it feeds Denver Union Station, which connects really well. Virginia Breeze, I think, is largely the same way. Of course, it goes to Washington D.C., which isn't technically a state, so it's. But other states really are set up for those longer distance trips. Ohio, Michigan, I think are good examples of that, where the subsidized network is kind of almost imperceptibly merged with the subsidized network, and customers don't really even know if they're on a state-supported bus or not, because the bus will say Barron's Bus or Indian Trails, and they also have unsubsidized services. So it's sort of a much more subtle form of building the network than prominent branding, uh, in other states. Um, but with that, I think there's advantages to both. Um, we are worried about the status of the national intercity bus network as stations disappear and federal lack of interest in supporting the sort of national system seems to be lacking at the moment. So we're fighting to make sure that it has a higher visibility in Washington because it is so important.
Thanks, Joe. And realize you may be off camera for a particular reason, but if you'd like to rejoin via video, that perfect.
There we go.
And yeah, just wanted to kind of combine two questions again, if that's all right. Jeffrey asks, what methods have been successful in identifying latent demand for intercity bus service? And then also, as you see that demand and are expanding service, are there some challenges or growing pains in growing that service? Ben, in your case in Colorado, or Joe, if you've seen kind of national examples of that.
For sure, I think our biggest single challenge, our expansion, has been acquiring additional fleet. So we've had to more than double our bus fleet on our main lines, the north, south, and west. And both with those long lead times associated with over-the-road motor coach procurements, and with the supply chain issues that are continuing to resolve themselves, but were especially acute in 2022 and points prior. We have had to modify our timetable for expansion a bit, but we are still on track at this point, at least, to deliver our full suite of expansion on time by the end of this year.
And I'll jump in our last couple of minutes. I saw a question there from Lawrence Hughes, who's quite an expert on bus service. How do you think about state support for preserving routes that aren't inherently profitable? And I think what I find really encouraging about intercity bus state support compared to, say, rail is how often it takes just a little nudge to keep those services going. And I've heard a figure, and it may not be common anymore, that often something like $5 a bus mile can make the difference between a bus line disappearing and one saving, staying profitable. So, it's if you have a 200-mile route, that might be $1,000 or so. Um, but if that serves, 60 people on the route, 70 people on the route who come and go, that can be a subsidy that's a fraction of the cost of say running a train service, sometimes level. So I think you can stretch it pretty far with this, with bus service. Every state has a different approach to this. Some, I think you mentioned in Colorado, Ben, you own the buses, and then you use private contractors who run those buses. Others, it's just the opposite, where it's a total contracting model, where there's a big RFP going out. Um, and so, but it is encouraging how um, it doesn't have to be run quite like public transit. There's a lot of revenue blocks, but you need a little more to make it sustainable.
Great, thanks. And just to everyone who may still have an unanswered question, just want to give a heads up that we'll compile those questions and we'll share them with the panelists so that you can get a follow-up as well. Are there any last questions, either Joe or Ben, you'd like to address in just the last couple minutes here? Anything that is top of mind for you?
Yeah, there are a lot of really good questions in here. Let me just grab a final one and give you a very short answer on that. Um, there was a comment I saw earlier. Here we go. About yeah, I had this question for Ben about peaking. So how big an issue is that for you? That Friday, Wednesday before Thanksgiving, you sell out a week in advance. Do you run extra buses? Do you peak price to sort of manage that?
Yeah, so you broke up a bit there, Joe, but I think I got the gist of your question. Um,
Okay.
we, in terms of demand surges, on our north and south lines, we typically run pretty well. We do, like you said, those rush periods, like Wednesday before Thanksgiving. We have had sellouts before on our north line, especially connecting those Colorado State University students back to the metro. But we are, in terms of peak demand, our big challenges have been on the west line. So we, at present, we do not do reservations for our main lines or for our outrider services, which has led to some uncomfortable situations where we have sellouts and unfortunately have to turn folks away at the gate. We know that's a massive negative impact on those folks when that does happen. And at this point, to sort of address that, we are hoping that expanding our frequency of service and our number of trips will help with those passenger overflows. So if we get through this winter and next period after expansion and we're still having consistent sellouts on the west line, I think we would have to look at a reservation system potentially. But for now, we are hoping that we can kind of grow our way out of the problem a bit.
Great. Well, want to say thanks to both Ben and Joe for giving us some great information. If you still have questions that you haven't thrown in the Q&A or chat, you can feel free to follow up, send it along to me. You should have my email maybe in your registration confirmation, and we can share those with the panelists as well and make sure people get the info that they need. And want to thank everyone for their time and appreciate you attending our webinar on state support for intercity buses, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks so much, Joel.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoyed it. See you later.